Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Radziński. As the preparations to use frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine intensify, Moscow is preparing a series of unfriendly moves of its own. Except its own nationalization plans seem to be aimed squarely at the private sector. The Kremlin has already moved against Russian billionaire Denis Shtengelov, but it also has Western corporations still operating in Russia in its sights. So how much harm can such actions do to the West? And what are the differences between Europe and America's efforts and the Kremlin's retaliatory push? Joining us here today is Taras Kuzio, Professor of Political Science at the National University of the Kiev-Mohyla Academy. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
So the Russians are promising to retaliate. Does this mean that they finally think the confiscation of assets is a realistic prospect? Because for the last 3 years, they didn't really issue such warnings, not quite as specific.
Well, they have already, in the last 3 years, introduced various penalties and fines if you try to withdraw from Russia. Excuse me. So you, for example, wouldn't be able to sell your business at the full market value. So you would have to pay some kind of tax, in inverted commas, to Russia. So this is now relatively a new step. We'll see if they implement it, because there still hasn't been a decision made by the Europeans on these frozen Russian assets. The French are supporting the Belgians against this step. But to be quite frank, if Russia goes ahead, there'll be no sympathy in the West for these Western businesses who remain in Russia. They have been advised for over 3 years, it's time for you to leave. Stop paying taxes to the Russian war machine. And they've ignored that advice. They've continued to, shall we say, make blood money. So if they are going to be nationalized by Putin's regime, I doubt there'll be any sympathy in the European Union or in Western Europe or in Europe in general.
So what you're saying is that it is really impossible to compare these two situations, because we're talking about the sovereign funds of the National Bank of Russia, right? The Russians are talking about private assets of private companies. And while it would be very difficult to say how much Western money is still in Russia, we only do know how many companies there are, about 2,400, I believe. There is still no equality between those two approaches, right? Because Russia is trying to pressure private companies since it doesn't have any sort of sovereign Western funds in its possession.
Yes, of course, that's true. But let's remember that Russia isn't a country with the rule of law. Legislation and the constitution in Russia mean nothing. So really, what takes place is up to Vladimir Putin. And yes, these are private companies who have made a decision, and some of these companies are big Western names. They've decided to remain in Russia despite Western pressure, Western lobbying for them to leave. They've decided to stay. They've decided to continue to make money in Russia and to pay money into the Russian government budget. So it's their decision. If they are going to lose that now, the onus or the responsibility for that is on the directors and the management of those companies. It's not something that can be blamed on, shall we say, the European Union or the G7 or something else. On the question of Russian assets, this would be only an attempt to, as it were, take funds in advance from Russia for the huge amount of damage and destruction it's undertaking in Ukraine. I mean, the estimated cost of rebuilding what Russia has destroyed in Ukraine is already something like nearly double what is the total of the frozen Russian assets in the West, which in both the United States, Canada, and Europe is about 300 billion. So as far as I understand, it's far more than that already that Russia would be expected to pay when the war ends for destruction in Ukraine. So yes, they are two different things, but and Russia will be condemned for taking that step in basically stealing Western companies. But those Western companies won't get much sympathy because they've been told to not remain inside Russia. They are breaking Western sanctions.
So now it's been over 3 years of these discussions concerning these frozen assets, and so far, no
Yes.
progress, apart from using the proceeds from these assets. But this is, of course, just a fraction. Now, who do you think is primarily to blame? I do remember reading an article by a Ukrainian journalist writing for one of the Polish websites, and she said that it's basically because this is mostly being held by what is essentially a private entity in Belgium, and that for that private entity, it's better to hold this money to actually generate, interests on that money, part of which is going to Ukraine, but apparently, according to that journalist, not all of it. Because, if you actually take this all away from them, they would stand to lose out on that. We're talking about Euroclear, obviously. Do you think it is true? Or are there any other entities, countries, or other forces which are firmly opposed to the idea of using these funds to help Ukraine?
Well, obviously, the usual suspects are Hungary and Slovakia, more Hungary than Slovakia, which adopt a pro-Russian line inside the European Union. But I don't think they're the main obstacle. The main obstacle, of course, are the Belgians. In the last few days, French President Macron has supported the Belgian position. I'm not a lawyer. There's a whole range of legal opinion about this question. From what I understand now, all the proposals are aiming to do is basically take an advance on these funds, which would be demanded from Russia anyway when the war ends, for payment for destruction of Ukraine. Let's remember that if the war ended tomorrow and there would be a need to rebuild Ukraine, who's going to pay for it? That's the ultimate question. Why should European taxpayers pay for it when there's this Russian money sitting in Belgium? Shouldn't the Russians be paying for it? And if the Russians are going to be paying for it, what difference does it make if it's those funds, in Belgium, or we introduce some kind of levy or tax on the export of Russian oil and gas? Somehow Russia's going to have to be made to pay for it. And this is just an attempt, I think, to do that. From my perspective, the whole debate around this is a kind of part of the general hypocrisy you have in Europe surrounding the whole question of dealing with Russia in this war. Let's remember that in the last 3 years, most European countries, including Poland, by the way, have paid more money to Russia for the import of gas, oil, and LNG than they have given in aid to Ukraine. Most European countries, about 2/3 of European countries, have done that. The Netherlands, which used to be run by the current NATO General Secretary, Mark Rutte, is still doing that to this day. So we have this strange environment in Europe, that Europe is paying still more money to Russia for importing energy. And here Donald Trump is absolutely correct in pointing out European hypocrisy on this question. So this is, I think, the frozen Russian assets are part of a general inability in Europe to actually understand what is taking place. This is a full-scale war, and why should the Ukrainians be the only ones suffering? Why can't the Europeans finally get their act together, including on this, reacting to Russian hybrid warfare throughout Europe? Why does it take so long? The Russians have been doing this for nearly 20 years.
So now let's take a look briefly at the Russian economy. Vladimir Putin has taken the decision to nationalize the assets of one of the Russian oligarchs. About 6 billion, I believe, is at stake here. Do you think that they are desperate, that the budget is groaning under the weight of sanctions and the recent attacks on the Russian energy infrastructure? What would the other oligarchs do faced with a similar prospects?
Well, the oligarchs can't do anything. I mean, there's been a very high number. I don't remember the actual number itself, but since 2022, a large number of Russian oligarchs and businessmen have died. Died. They've been killed. They just happen to have fallen out of windows. I mean, it seems to be a very major problem in Russia that if you sit too close to a window, you fall out. So yes, this Putin's regime is taking back, Putin's regime was built on allowing oligarchs to steal money. And then in return for that, they would be required to provide political loyalty. That was the deal. That deal has now changed. The economy is desperate. It's not just sanctions, it's a mixture of Ukrainian attacks on Russia's main exploit, oil and gas, the refineries, and also the huge budget outlay. Russia's spending something like 40+% of its budget on its military and security forces. This can't continue. So I think a combination of these factors is forcing Putin's regime to be creative, if you want to call it that way, and that is to steal the assets which were previously stolen by oligarchs, steal it from them, to get rid of those oligarchs. They're no longer needed. They are the old ruling elite. We will now create a new ruling elite. And also from maybe nationalizing foreign companies in Russia. Yes, there is a sign of desperation here. But the irony, of course, is that Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil refineries, which have now put out of action close to 40% of Russian refineries, is having a more successful job than Western sanctions on Russia.
Professor Taras Kuzio was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much.
And I'm Jonasz Rywinski. You're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news, updates and commentary.